December 1914, the Western Front. 5 months earlier, Europe had marched to war with flags waving and bands playing. Young men, British and German alike, had boarded trains with smiles, told by their leaders that they would be home by Christmas. They believed it would be a glorious adventure, a quick cavalry charge to victory. They were wrong. By December, the concept of glory had died in the mud of Belgium and northern France. The war of movement had ground to a halt, replaced by a 400-mile scar across the face of Europe, a double line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This story is not about generals or grand strategy. It is about the ordinary men stuck in those ditches. It is about a moment when the shared misery of the human condition overcame the orders to kill. It is the story of the day the guns stopped firing, not because of a treaty signed in a palace, but because of a Christmas carol sung in the dark. To understand the miracle, you must first understand the misery. In the weeks leading up to Christmas 1914, the weather in Flanders turned vicious. It rained relentlessly. The trenches, dug hastily into the low-lying water tables, flooded. Soldiers stood in water up to their knees for days on end. For the British Tommy in his khaki uniform and the German Fritz in his field gray, life became a singular obsession, battling the mud. It coated everything. It froze into sharp ridges at night and melted into a clinging glue during the day. It swallowed boots, rifles, and sometimes men. Then came the cold. A sharp, biting frost settled over the battlefield. The temperatures dropped well below freezing. Wet uniforms turned into stiff boards of ice against the skin. A new enemy emerged, one more immediate than the opposing army: trench foot. Toes turned black and dead from the constant freezing wet. Morale was at rock bottom. These were not professional killers. They were postmen, factory workers, clerks, and farmers. They were terribly homesick. As Christmas approached, the contrast between the warm, candlelit homes they remembered and the frozen, rat-infested ditches they inhabited became almost unbearable. They were tired, they were dirty, and they were disillusioned. The propaganda posters back home depicted the enemy as monsters, barbarians, barely human. But the reality of trench warfare taught them something else entirely. The most surreal aspect of the Western Front in 1914 was the proximity of the enemy. In some sectors, the distance between the British front line and the German front line, the area known as no man's land, was no more than 60 or 70 yards. A strong arm could throw a tin of bully beef from one trench to the other. In this intimate proximity, you couldn't maintain the illusion that the enemy was a faceless monster. You could hear them. During the quiet hours of the night, British sentries peering over the parapet could hear the Germans talking, laughing at a joke, or coughing from the damp air. They could smell the distinct aroma of German tobacco and frying sausages. They realized that the men across the way were enduring the exact same hell. They were freezing together, suffering together, dying together in the same muddy field. A strange live and let live system had already begun to develop in quiet sectors. If the Germans didn't shell the British latrines during breakfast, the British wouldn't snipe at the German supply lines during dinner. It was an unauthorized, unspoken agreement, born of mutual exhaustion. But as Christmas Eve approached, the high command on both sides grew nervous. British generals issued strict orders warning against any fraternization. They feared that if the men realized their shared humanity, they might stop fighting. They ordered increased artillery barrages on Christmas Eve to ensure the spirit of the season was crushed by high explosives. But orders written in comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines could not stop what was about to happen at the front. December 24th, 1914. Christmas Eve. The day began like any other, with the dawn stand-to, rifles ready for an attack that didn't come. But as the day progressed, the atmosphere shifted. The relentless rain finally stopped, and a hard, crisp freeze set in. The mud hardened, the air became clear and sharp. Then the mail arrived. For the British soldiers, there were thousands of packages from home. Every soldier received a brass tin from Princess Mary, filled with cigarettes, tobacco, and a Christmas card from the king. There were puddings, knitted socks from mothers, and letters from sweethearts. On the German side, the celebration was even more intense. The German army made a massive effort to send Christmas trees, small Tannenbaums complete with candles. As darkness fell over the Western Front on Christmas Eve, the guns, for the most part, fell silent. The usual crack of sniper fire and the thump of artillery faded away. A strange, unnerving quiet settled over the frozen landscape. Along the British lines near Armentières, shivering sentries stared out into the dark expanse of no man's land. Then they saw something incredible. Small lights were appearing along the parapet of the German trenches. One by one, flickering golden lights pierced the darkness. The Germans were placing their lit Christmas trees up on the trench edge, in full view of the British riflemen. It was a suicidal act. They were perfect targets, but no one fired. And then the sound began. It floated across the frozen, body-strewn ground of no man's land. It wasn't a war cry. It was a rich baritone voice singing in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The British soldiers in their dugouts froze. They knew that tune. It was Silent Night. The singing grew louder. Soon, entire German regiments were singing carols. The sound was surreal, beautiful, and utterly out of place in a landscape designed for death. The British soldiers listened in awed silence for a moment. Then, spontaneously, down the line, someone began to sing back. They answered with English carols, the first Noel, O Come All Ye Faithful. It became a bizarre duel of songs. The Germans would finish a verse, and cheers would ring out from the British trenches. Then the British would sing, and the Germans would applaud. For hours, the enemies serenaded each other across the narrow strip of frozen land that separated their worlds. The hatred, the propaganda, and the fear began to melt away in the cold night air. As midnight approached, the singing faded. But the silence that followed was different. It was no longer a tense silence waiting for violence. It was an expectant silence. Down in the trenches, men were making decisions that could get them court-martialed and shot. But the spirit of the night was stronger than military discipline. In the dark, a voice called out from the German trenches in broken English. "Hello, Tommy. You no shoot, we no shoot." The response shouted back from the British side was immediate. "All right, Fritz, we won't shoot." It was a verbal contract in the dark. But would it hold when the sun rose on Christmas morning?
Christmas morning, 1914. The sun rose slowly over Flanders, struggling to pierce the thick, freezing mist that clung to the ground. The landscape revealed by the light was one of utter desolation. Shattered trees looked like broken teeth against the gray sky. Craters filled with frozen water dotted the fields. And everywhere the barbed wire rusted in the damp air. But there was one thing missing: the noise. For months, the morning had been greeted by the hate of machine guns and the roar of artillery. Today, there was only the sound of birds. A skylark sang somewhere high above the trenches, a sound usually drowned out by death. In the British trench, a private peeked over the sandbags. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Look," he whispered, "they're coming out." Across the frozen expanse of no man's land, figures were climbing out of the German trenches. They weren't charging with bayonets. They were walking. They had no rifles. Their hands were raised, open and empty. "Don't shoot!" a German voice rang out. "We want to speak." The British officers were paralyzed. This was against every rule of war. It was mutiny. It was madness. But the curiosity of the soldiers was stronger than the shouting of the sergeants. One by one, the British soldiers began to climb out. They left their Lee Enfield rifles leaning against the trench walls. They stepped onto the forbidden ground. The first meeting happened in the middle of no man's land. A German soldier and a British soldier, wary at first, circled each other like nervous cats. Then the German extended a hand. The British soldier took it. The handshake was the spark. Suddenly hundreds of men were swarming out of the ditches, the khaki of the British Empire mixed with the fields gray of the German Imperial Army. Men who had been trying to kill each other 24 hours ago were now shaking hands, patting each other on the back, and exchanging cigarettes. The scenes that unfolded in no man's land were surreal. It was a bizarre, spontaneous market day in the middle of a slaughterhouse. The soldiers didn't speak the same language, but they spoke the universal language of generosity. The Germans had plenty of cigars and sausages. The British had plum puddings and jams. They bartered. "Cigarette?" asked a British Tommy, offering a tin of Woodbines. "Ja, danke," the German replied, handing over a heavy meerschaum pipe in return. They showed each other photographs. A German soldier pulled a tattered black-and-white picture from his tunic pocket. "Mein Kind," he said softly, pointing to a little girl. "My child." The British soldier nodded, pulling out a picture of his own wife back in Birmingham. In that moment, the propaganda dissolved. They saw that the monsters they were fighting were just fathers, sons, and husbands who wanted to go home just as badly as they did. One British barber, who had his kit with him, set up a stool in the middle of a shell crater and gave a German soldier a haircut. Another group shared a bottle of schnapps, toasting good health to the men they were supposed to bayonet. But amidst the laughter, there was a grim task to be done. The truce allowed the men to retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades that had been lying in no man's land for weeks. The ground was too frozen to dig deep graves, so they worked together to bury the dead in shallow mounds. In one sector, a British chaplain and a German divinity student stood side by side. They read the 23rd Psalm together, one in English, one in German. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Der Herr ist mein Hirte, mir wird nicht mangeln." Around them, bare-headed soldiers from both armies stood in silence. For a moment, they were not enemies. They were just mourners at the same funeral. And then the legend came to life. Someone, somewhere along the line, produced a football. History debates exactly where it came from. Perhaps a deflated ball kicked out from a trench, or maybe a bundle of rags tied together with string. But it didn't matter. "Football!" the cry went up. Jackets were thrown down to mark goalposts. The frozen, cratered ground became a pitch. The teams were not 11 against 11, but 50 against 50, a chaotic, joyous mob chasing the ball across the ice. There were no referees. There were no rules. A British soldier kicked the ball high into the air, and a dozen Germans chased it, slipping and sliding on the frozen mud. Laughter rang out, loud, belly-shaking laughter that hadn't been heard in Flanders for months. One British soldier later wrote in his diary, "It was a great game. The Germans were extremely sporting. I don't recall the score, but I remember the feeling. For an hour, we were just boys playing in a park." It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming their humanity. Every kick of the ball was a protest against the war. Every cheer was a defiance of the generals who wanted them to hate. As the short winter day began to fade, the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. The cold returned with a vengeance. The men knew the dream was ending. They couldn't stay in no man's land forever. The officers, nervous about the generals finding out, began to order the men back. The partings were reluctant. "Good luck," a British soldier said to a German he had spent the afternoon with. "To you also, my friend. Keep your head down." They shook hands one last time. They didn't want to let go. To let go meant returning to the role of the killer. Slowly, the khaki uniforms drifted back to the British trenches, and the gray uniforms melted back into the German lines. The football was put away. The gifts were stowed in pockets. As night fell, silence returned to the Western Front. But it was a heavy, melancholy silence. A flare shot up from the German lines, illuminating the empty battlefield in a ghostly white light. Then a machine gun chattered in the distance, a warning shot, fired high into the air, signaling that the truce was officially over. Down in the dugouts, the men sat in the dark, smoking the enemy's tobacco. They looked at the buttons and souvenirs they had traded. They thought about the men across the field, Hans, Fritz, Wilhelm. How could they shoot them now? How could you kill a man who had just shown you a picture of his daughter? How could you throw a grenade at a man who had just played football with you? The generals were furious when they found out. They issued strict orders. Anyone found fraternizing with the enemy in the future would be court-martialed for treason. The war machine demanded blood, and it would not tolerate friendship. The Christmas Truce of 1914 never happened again on such a scale. The war would drag on for 4 more years. Millions more would die. The mud would return, deeper and bloodier than before. But for one day, one single miraculous day, the human spirit had triumphed over the machine of war. They proved that beneath the uniforms, beneath the orders, and beneath the hatred, they were all just men, cold and far from home, wishing for peace. And that is the story of the day the guns fell silent.